Okay, let's now talk about this circular ditch that Plato described. I will now describe the plain as it was fashioned by nature and by the labors of many generations of kings through long ages. It was for the most part rectangular and oblong, and where falling out of the straight line followed the circular ditch. So apparently the plain got intercepted by this circular ditch. Once again, it was for the most part rectangular and oblong, and where falling out of the straight line followed the circular ditch. The depth and width and length of this ditch were incredible, and gave the impression that a work of such extent, in addition to so many others, could never have been artificial. Nevertheless, I must say what I was told. It was excavated to the depth of 100 feet, and its breadth was a stadium everywhere. It was carried round the whole of the plain, and was 10,000 stadia in length. It received the streams which came down from the mountains, and winding round the plain and meeting at the city, was there left off into the sea. Further inland likewise, straight canals of 100 feet in width were cut from it through the plain, and again led off into the ditch. So these were cut through the plain and again led off into the ditch. This indicates this humongous ditch is below the plain. Once again, straight canals of 100 feet in width were cut from it through the plain, and again led off into the ditch, leading to the sea. So apparently you have the plain above, this giant ditch, circular ditch below, and that leading to the sea. So let's take a look. First of all, we have concluded that 1,000 stadia is 115 miles. So 10,000 stadia is 1,150 miles circumference. So here, the plain being above, we have this humongous circular ditch which leads toward the sea. Now the yellow circle I've drawn here indicates the 1,150 mile circumference that would be equal to a 10,000 stadia circumference circle, which would be about 183 miles in radius if you have 1,150 mile circumference. So we can see that once again, this measurement is not exact for this ditch. But when we pay attention to all the even numbers used by Plato, we must understand these are estimates. To find natural landmarks that are exactly 10,000 this, or 1,000 that, or 50 stadia long, etc., well, it would seem it'd be virtually impossible for these to be exact measurements. But if we look at an estimation of 10,000 stadia circumference of a huge ditch, then, well, take a look at that. Not that far off at all as a nice estimation. Then we have a few things mentioned that we need to separate out. First of all, the depth, width, and length of this ditch were incredible. And as we know, 10,000 stadia was already mentioned. But then we also have mentioned it was excavated to the depth of 100 feet and its breadth was a stadium everywhere. So it sounds like we have two things being referred to here. Number one, a ditch that is humongous. Then we have what appears to be a river going around this giant ditch. It says it was excavated to the depth of 100 feet and its breadth was a stadium everywhere. So a stadium breadth would be the width of what sounds like a river. And as we can see from earlier views of this ditch when we were receding the water, there are actually gaps in between the edge and the inner part that appear to be able to carry water. And also based on these maps, you can see right here, as we turn the map into an overlay on the actual land, that indeed it appears there were rivers running the edge. This is just what they found from excavations, etc. Perhaps there are more connections. It shows here, agreeing with Plato's description, that water reaching the ditch would indeed flow downward, 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 and down toward the sea. But there's one thing more to be learned by this historical account of the size of this ditch. Just looking at it from here, we may not realize this, But when Plato said the ditch was humongous, he was not joking. So here we are with the ditch. Let's go ahead and cut out the actual size and do some comparisons. Since I live in America, and perhaps some of you do also, let's do some comparisons to how big this ditch really is. Now, these are not the size of the measurement Plato described, for as we mentioned, that measurement was even bigger. This is the size of the actual ditch we find in Mauritania. And as you can see, it's as big as many states in the United States, even bigger, or just as big. And here's some on the West Coast, just as big as many states in the United States. So we're talking about a state-sized ditch. And when we think about that, we can almost help but come to conclude that this ditch could not be seen by the naked eye, and therefore described. Even the eye of the Sahara over here, even that could not be seen, they said, except from space satellites. So if you're not going to see that, you're very much not going to see this. And this brings to mind some interesting things I heard by doing research, and I do apologize, I can't bring the exact sources back to memory to share with you, but the information referenced how Atlas and the Atlanteans had figured out the secret to mapping huge areas. And I even wonder if that's where the term Atlas today comes from, Atlas being a book of maps. The historical record that was passed down to Plato that mentioned a giant circular ditch, which in reality would be a humongous circular canyon, that's just so huge. But I remember reading theories that the Atlanteans, and especially apparently Atlas, the reason they were able to travel to various islands was because they had discovered the secrets to actually making accurate maps. And the only way you're going to get a historical reference to a circular ditch described as 1,150 miles in circumference is one of two ways. They either had access to flight, or they were excellent mappers. They had figured out the secrets to mapping accurately. The more scientific-minded would certainly believe that the ability to accurately map is more reasonable than to say that they had flying machines. But of course, everyone has their own opinions. Just for fun, I looked up Atlas in Wikipedia, and I ran across this, quite interesting. A euhemerist origin for Atlas was as a legendary Atlas, king of Mauritania. Yes, it actually says it, the place that we're looking at right now. And said, an expert astronomer. And as many know, people travel the oceans and find their direction across oceans to various lands using positions of stars and constellations in the sky to know where exactly they're going and where they're coming from and where they are. So that's fascinating. And here is something interesting. Atlantic Ocean means Sea of Atlas, while Atlantis means Island of Atlas. Pretty fascinating also. Anyways, you can read all this yourself if you would like. So we found the flat plain, and we found a humongous circular ditch. And we've seen how the water, when it hits the ditch, does indeed seem to be able to travel toward the sea. May I just take a moment and say, wow, that's something. So there you go. This was Greenland, very habitable. Those 5,000 plus years ago, a lot of flat land, flat plain, more so than anything around the Mediterranean. Look at this, mountainous, rocky, mountainous. This part down here is actually the Mediterranean Sea, but looks like mountainous. Here's Egypt with all of that there. Looks like we have some flat land here, close to Egypt. Not too bad. But nothing in size that compares. A little bit over here too. Nothing in size that really compares to this area right here. Pretty impressive. Lots of lakes, lots of rivers, and of course, dropping down from the precipitous high land, dropping down and going toward the ocean.